Before European settlement began in the United States, the Philadelphia riverward neighborhoods, now known as Fishtown, Kensington, and Port Richmond, were called Cacamensi, an ancient Native American settlement belonging to the Lenni Lenape tribe that encompassed a 1,600-acre plot of land that ranged from today's northern Liberties to Port Richmond. Cacamensi, meaning the place where chiefs meet, in a Native American dialect, was a place of great importance to the Native Americans and later to English settlers who pronounced Cacamensi as Shakamaksin.
But the Swedes were the first one to settle here in 1634. The Swedes didn't really last that long. There might have been a half a dozen Swedish families, maybe 30, 40 people at the most, who lived in what we would call Fishtown, Kensington, Port Richmond today.
Soon after, many wars ensued, according to Milano.
The Swedes got beat up by the Dutch in 1654. The Dutch took over, and then there was a couple wars between the Dutch and the English. The Anglo-Dutch wars finally ended around 1673 with the English on top.
According to the Pennsbury Manor website, William Penn's father had been an admiral in the Navy and was a staunch royalist, someone who supported the monarchy. Penn's father supported King Charles I of England when he was overthrown and beheaded during the English Civil War. When the monarchy came back into power shortly after, Penn's father used his own personal wealth to rebuild the navy which King Charles II would be indebted to him for. In 1680, Penn approached King Charles II to collect on the debt the monarchy owed the now deceased Admiral Penn. Penn requested land in America where he envisioned a colony that would become, quote, the seed of a nation, a colony and a government that would showcase his ideals. In 1682, Tamanend, the head chief of the Turtle Clan of the Unami tribe of the Lenni Lenape, made his, quote, treaty of amity and friendship with Penn in Shakamaksin. This event is memorialized at Penn Treaty Park in Fishtown and in painter Benjamin West's famous painting, Penn's Treaty with the Indians.
What he did was he offered his settlers, if you bought 5,000 acres of land in the interior, he gave you 50 acres in the Liberty land and then a town lot downtown. So there are 3 different parcels of land. And this area here, where Fishtown and Kensington and Port Richmond was the Northern Liberties area. And a lot of these people, the first purchasers, were just investors. They never really came and immigrated. They just bought the land and held it, and like they do today, flipped it. And they started accumulating them in bulk. So Anthony Palmer was one of those guys.
Anthony Palmer was an English merchant who came to the colonies from Barbados. He moved into the Fairman's Mansion on the Delaware River in Kensington. He is considered the founder of the Kensington area, which now encompasses all of Kensington, Fishtown, and Port Richmond. Kensington was separated from the rest of the city due to the Cohocson Creek and the surrounding marshes. Quote, to attract residents to this isolated area, Palmer subdivided his ground into smaller lots and leased them at very attractive rates. 2 unique contingents took advantage of Palmer's offer, and their descendants would shape Kensington for the next century, end quote, according to a journal article entitled Old Kensington by Rich Reamer. One of these groups was made up of English and Welsh shipwrights. Shipbuilding became one of the earliest and most profitable industries due to the immense amount of timber in Pennsylvania. However, there was little shoreline ideal for shipbuilding on the majority of Philadelphia's coast, whereas Kensington had sloping beaches that were ideal for ship construction and repair work. Quote, shipwrights were an inbred, clannish lot, intermarrying and keeping business and craft secrets within the family, said Reamer. The physical remoteness of Kensington reinforced this insularity, and soon the overlay of family and business and community began to develop that would characterize the neighborhood for generations, end quote. The second group consisted of the Palatines, German-speaking immigrants. The Palatines were colonial America's largest ethnic minority and settled in Kensington as fishermen.
It was an easy occupation. You can sew together some nets, walk out into the Delaware, cast your nets. You used to be able to walk to New Jersey on the back of the shad fish, and with so many fish, so plentiful, and you could pay your taxes in fish.
The language barrier and the sense of culture the Palatines managed to maintain added to the insularity of the Kensington community. Quote, gradually the 2 communities began to blend, first through labor, then after a few generations through love and marriage, end quote, said Reamer. By the time the Revolutionary War began in 1777, Palmer had died. Kensington was now well known as a maritime area and built boats for the American Revolutionary Army. Kensington then ceased shipbuilding while the neighborhood endured fires, raids, and floods while it was occupied by the British until 1783. The war, although harsh, would prove to bring more resources to the neighborhood. Quote, John Hewson, an English textile printer, had arrived in Philadelphia on the eve of war, been chased out by the British, and returned to start Kensington's textile industry with America's first batch of calico, printed at Kensington's Governor's Mill, said Reamer. On the brink of the Revolution, a glass factory had opened briefly on Gunner's Run that would signal the birth of Kensington's glass industry. End quote. Before these industries could take off, Kensington found itself in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, a 25-year power struggle between England and France. This war made the United States a leading international supplier and carrier of goods, and single-handedly brought Kensington to the forefront as a leader in inventing and exporting goods during the Industrial Revolution. The neighborhood flourished. More shipyards were built as metal replaced wood, and a brass foundry opened. Inns and taverns were built on every major intersection. John Harrison, America's first industrial chemist, invented sulfuric acid, essential to the production of textiles, glass, and metal products. Due to the chemical's dangerous nature, it had to be transported in fragile glass containers, encouraging textile and glass manufacturers to move to Kensington.
The fishermen wound up intermarrying and would put their sons and sons-in-laws and nephews and cousins in all the different riverfront towns along the Delaware River, both sides, from the Trenton Falls down to Cape May. And so they literally controlled the entire catch of the Delaware, which is why we became known as Fishtown. We were more than just a neighborhood place to buy fish, it was for the Delaware Valley.
Once the Kensington neighborhood began to support itself in being an industrial powerhouse, lines began to be drawn between the different communities. Charles H. Cramp, industrialist and descendant of a fishing family in Fishtown, explained how Fishtown came to differentiate itself in the Philadelphia Public Ledger on March 7, 1909. Quote, the term Fishtown was first applied to a corner of the triangle of Old Kensington between Cherry, now Burks, Street, and Gunner's Run, now Aramingo Avenue, and from both sides of Old Point Road, now Richmond Street, to the river, where the shore fishermen lived. These were generally the proprietors of large shad fisheries in the Delaware, and used large nets employed in extensive spaces away from the channel where large numbers of shad were feeding. End quote. In a memoir from 1850, the neighborhood and its inhabitants are described as prideful and clannish, and did not tolerate other Kensingtonians claiming to be from Fishtown. The memoir includes a detailed account of what life looked like at this time in Fishtown. Quote, their dwellings were mostly built of wood, with a large yard containing a garden, the fences freshly whitewashed, and the walls of their kitchens bedecked with tinware. In nearly every square there resided a, quote, smoker, whose business it was to smoke the shad or herring brought to him by the fishermen, to be stored for winter use. The spring of the year was always a busy time for the fisher folks, for during the winter the seines and nets were repaired, and the toms, buoys, fastened to an end of a seine or net, painted. Now, the buddies banded together to fish for shad in common, for it requires some brawn to row a gilling skiff and pay out or haul in the seine with fish. Nor was there much comfort connected therewith when fishing offshore, standing in water up to the hips in months of April and May. End quote. By the late 1800s, the states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware all struggled to regulate fishing on the Delaware River. Pennsylvania was preoccupied with the Susquehanna River, leaving the Delaware River to New Jersey. However, since fisheries along the Delaware River were chiefly owned and operated by Pennsylvanians, namely Kensington and Fishtown families, they felt they did not need to adhere to the laws of New Jersey, causing complaints from the few Jersey-owned fisheries. Quote, by 1875, the approximately 30 fisheries in that 100-mile stretch were controlled directly or indirectly by the 5 major fishery families of the Fishtown neighborhood, according to a journal article entitled Fishtown and the Shad Fisheries by Rich Reamer. Pennsylvania ended up stepping in upon realizing the majority of fishermen were Pennsylvanians and attempted to improve regulations. The shad fishing industry ended up collapsing in the early 1900s regardless, due to overfishing, pollution, and environmental degradation. Many fishermen families found work in the Kensington shipyards until the end of World War II.
After World War II, starts the big decline, right? People start moving to the burbs, industries start shutting down, moving down south or to Southeast Asia. And then as a kid, it seemed like there was a factory burning every other month, whether it was on purpose by the owners or just juvenile delinquents messing them up. Lots of drugs started to come in the 1970s. That was like we were like the meth capital in the 1970s. and then that evolved into the opioid capital, ground zero of America, right? Not just the city, but America. And then we get to today, where the western area is bombed out, and the eastern and south area is gentrifying.
Today, Fishtown is no longer a hustling and bustling fish market, but rather a gentrifying neighborhood. Identified by the zip code 19125, Fishtown forms a triangle of 3 streets: Frankfort Avenue, East Lehigh Avenue, and North Delaware Avenue. It is still a neighborhood inhabited by white people, but the English, Welsh, and German have been surpassed by the Irish and the Italian, who now make up 37% of the neighborhood population together, according to the 2022 American Community Survey put out by the U.S. Census. Those of English descent make up just under 11%, Germans make up a little less than 17%, and the Welsh are entirely no longer. In the context of the United States, gentrification tends to be thought of as people of color being pushed out of their communities by wealthy white people.
Fishtown is a bit of a strange example of gentrification because it's not a neighborhood that experienced racial turnover in any way. It's a historically white working class neighborhood that is still white.
In Collins's dissertation, he explains that by the late 1900s, Fishtown had gained a reputation of being known as, quote, insular, racist, and hostile to outsiders, particularly toward black folks, end quote. Mayor Edward G. Rendell's administration grew concerned with this, in addition to Fishtown's aging population and growing vacancy. Quote, Mayor Edward G. Rendell's administration put a plan in place to make the city and neighborhoods like Fishtown more attractive, particularly to young, middle-class, college-educated folks. The result was the city's 10-year tax abatement program that was expanded in 2000, end quote, according to Collins's dissertation. According to an article by Giuliano Domenico in the Passyunk Post, the goal of the tax abatement program was to encourage development, add new housing in the city, and boost the local economy by allowing residential property owners to avoid paying housing taxes for 10 years on the value of improvements related to new construction and rehabilitated properties. For newly built housing stock that received the abatement from the city, they did not have to pay taxes for a decade on the new or rehab structure, only on the land under the buildings. This had mixed effects across the city, but in Fishtown it proved to be quite successful. After the Great Recession in 2012, development spread from Northern Liberties to Fishtown. According to an article from the Inquirer written by Jake Blumgart and Kastri Pananjadi that looks back on how the tax abatement program affected the city, quote, few neighborhoods transformed as dramatically following the Great Recession. Residential energy spilled over into the commercial corridors too, changing them so much that today the Frankfort Avenue commercial corridor is almost unrecognizable from its pre-2012 state, end quote. Census data shows that at this time, the majority of Fishtown residents ranged from 25 to 39 years of age. Census data from 2022 shows this is still true, but every other age range is 3/4 less than this millennial and Gen Z crowd. 11% of Fishtown residents live in poverty, 23% of which are residents older than 65, according to census data from 2022. In addition, 66% of Fishtown residents have at least a bachelor's degree, but over half of that percentage is made up of residents ranging from 20 to 34 years of age. The tax abatement proved not to only be successful at drawing in a younger, wealthier, and higher educated crowd, but also at raising prices, not just in real estate, but in everything in the community. Jack Einacker, a committee person and veteran organizer representing the 18th Ward of Fishtown, saw the class disparity immediately when he moved to Fishtown from Fairmount Park in 2017. A kid living on the block offered to help Einacker and his family move into their house.
I started asking questions, and it was like, I bet this kid knows where the really good pizza is, for example. And he gave me a place, and then he says, yeah, the pizza down the road is great, but it's $7 a slice. Whatever it was. And he was talking about Bedia. Bedia Pizza, who was named at the time like the best pizza in the United States. But for that kid, it was charging kind of a large price per slice. And for that kid, it was kind of out of reach, right? So I think that in that very small moment, there were big changes that were happening to the neighborhood that while some folks found great, it put it out of reach of other folks.
These higher-end businesses became more and more popular throughout Fishtown thanks to the media's mass marketing of Fishtown's gentrification process highlighted in Collins' dissertation. Quote, in 2013, the New York Times wrote a piece highlighting Fishtown's creative renaissance. In 2018, Forbes magazine called Fishtown one of America's hottest new neighborhoods. And in somewhat of a full-circle moment to the New York Times' 2005 article calling Philadelphia the next borough, the New York Times included Fishtown in its list of top destinations for folks visiting Philadelphia, comparing the neighborhood to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. End quote. For some business owners, they opened their doors due to seeing a need in the community. Nima Etemadi, owner of Cake Life Bakery, a bakery in Fishtown, opened his business when he moved here from New York City 13 years ago.
Well, when I was first living here, we were still sort of deciding where we wanted Cake Life to be. And at that time, Fishtown didn't have any retail bakeries, like not one. And so it made a lot of sense to us to think about the neighborhood and, we saw other areas like South Philly as like a little bit more saturated with bakeries, and this community as being one that like maybe needed one or could benefit or have some neighborhood enrichment from having one.
Paul Kimport, owner of Johnny Brenda's, a restaurant and bar that serves as a music venue, moved to Fishtown and opened his business for the same reason 22 years ago.
I think the goal of the business has been that to be useful amenity for the neighborhood and a reflection of the neighborhood. It's not a theme place like Italian restaurant or Mexican restaurant. It's a neighborhood place. So to be useful, we've always tried to have daytime, evening hours, so it's always accessible. So an amenity to the neighborhood, essentially.
To outsiders and residents alike, a lot of Fishtown has changed, and many, like Etemadi, argue for the better.
What we hear in terms of complaints is often around the culture change. And that culture change is usually kind of manifesting as diversification. And that is an aspect of change here that I feel very comfortable with, and I feel proud of actually being a part of. There's way more residents of color in Fishtown than there ever were before. There also is way more queer and trans visibility here. And as like a woman in queer business, a woman in trans business specifically, that's something that we've been very upfront about. So we wave our pride flags, and we are part of that change in that way.
Milano, a longtime resident who was born and raised in Fishtown, sees a positive change in improving infrastructure.
I mean, when we were a struggling working class community, lower income community, the city really didn't give a crap. I mean, they only cared, on election day, they had to show their face and try to get the votes, and people would always pull the Democratic ticket. It didn't really matter if our schools were horrible or our playgrounds were terrible or the streets were filthy or, the infrastructure was kaput. But move a bunch of middle class people in the neighborhood, and our playgrounds are beautiful. It's amazing. They realize that we exist up here. It's just fantastic. But not just the city government, but like places like the Historical Society, right? They come up once in a while and stuff like that. I mean, so that's a good thing. The infrastructure has gotten better for the neighborhood. Schools are not so. Schools are a little better, and that's really a push by the new people.
But with the good change comes an equal amount of struggle. Taxes and rents have gone up for one, but to Jimmy Burke, a longtime Fishtown resident, there also seems to be a disconnect between the old-timers and the new residents.
Almost like a house divided sometimes, to put it that way, because people see things differently. But I think in the end, like the Fishtown Neighbors Association or FNA, it's hard to explain. Like everybody wants to get along, but in some cases it's very difficult, and because people have different views on things. Like I said, I'll give you an example. Like if I go on these, I told you, like these pages, you'll see these Fishtown pages, and you'll see somebody talking about a dog or a cat. But the block they live on, in the past 2 months, there could have been 3 break-ins. They seem to think that's not a big deal. To an OG, an original, that's the big deal. And that's where the divide is. Like
Einacker argues those disputes have only appeared on social media platforms and not in the neighborhood itself.
When you are talking about kind of like problems between old and new residents.
Sure.
How, besides just parking, like how else have you seen that throughout the community?
It's a really good question. I think it comes out, it's funny because it comes out more online than I think it does in real life.
Kim Port believes betterment of the neighborhood can come in the form of more community-oriented events. He started many community initiatives like the Fishtown Shad Festival, the Girard Coalition, and the Fishtown Area Business Association, to name a few. He even fought for the community to embrace the name Fishtown when some did not want to use the name due to possibly having a negative connotation.
It's like the name is a gift. It's such an interesting name, and as a community, you should see the value of like, you know, being proud of your name and trying to demonstrate why it's good and get excited about the history of it and the identity of it, and give a positive association to what it means.
Etamati has tried to bridge the gap between long-term and new residents by ensuring there is something for everyone at Cake Life.
Like I was saying, a big part of our thinking for our menu is just like, how accessible is it? And so while we do have larger items that are a higher price point, we always try to have, items for under $5 too. Like right now, most of our cookies are $3.50. Pre-pandemic, we had items that were lower than that too, but inflation has hit us all. And so like that is a fairly significant factor for us to just like, make sure everybody feels welcome here, but also that like there is something for everyone.
Although there are efforts to maintain the balance between the old and the new, Milano believes gentrification is a double-edged sword.
I probably come off like I hate new people, right? I don't really hate new people. I'm very happy that people are moving in who don't commit crimes. This is a big deal for me. As I've gotten older, it's even more of a bigger deal, right? I don't want to get knocked on my head when I walk to the store. So that's a good thing. And I imagine the new folks would get involved and help neighbors if they need to. Like if there's an old person on the block, I'm sure the new people would help raise money to help them if their house burnt down. I think they're very good, decent people. It's just that, it's a double-edged sword, gentrification. It's not all glory for people who lived here for a while. You've basically taken the neighborhood away from them. It's not their neighborhood anymore.